All right, everybody. Once again, my name is Tanya Hertz, and I am your instructor for this segment on legal forms of business ownership. And we're going to go through the most common business structures. And there are four types of business ownership. Typically, traditionally, there were three primary types of ownership, including sole proprietorship, partnership, and corporation. There's the newest, and I say new, but it's actually been around for over 15 years now. The newest form of business ownership is an LLC. An LLC is not a corporation, although often it is categorized or lumped together with corporations because it acts somewhat like a corporation, but it's a different form of ownership. LLC actually means limited liability company. And we're going to go through the benefits and drawbacks of each of the different types of business ownership, but just the basics of them, starting with sole proprietorship. This is the oldest form of business ownership, and this is the most common form of ownership. This is sole proprietorship is when one person owns the business. One person owns everything that the business owns, and everything that the business owns belongs to that one person. There's no separation between the business and the owner. That's a sole proprietorship. If you were to start a business today and you did no paperwork, you just decided, I'm a freelancer, I'm going to start this company, you'd be a sole proprietor. You'd be sole proprietor. The second type of business ownership is a partnership. And a partnership is very much like a sole proprietorship, except you can't have a sole proprietorship if there's only one person. You need to have more than one person. So whenever you have more than one person, the default condition in that relationship is a partnership. A partnership is very much like a sole proprietorship in that all of the liabilities, the encumbrances, and the profits and the assets of the business are combined with the owners. There's no separation. There's no protection for liabilities. So if one of the partners makes a decision that would affect the business, it not just affects the business, it also affects the other owner in the relationship because they're so intrinsically attached to the business. Any one partner in a partnership can encumber the business and the partnership, and so they could go out, they could get credit cards, they could charge those credit cards up on whatever they wanted to, and as long as that was done under that partnership, both partners would be liable. And so a partnership can be a really risky form of business ownership. It's not one that I would recommend. There are better forms of ownership if you're starting with another human being, including the corporate structure. A corporation is a legal structure where the business is wholly separate from the business owners. Starting a corporation is almost like having a kid. It has its own identity, its own corporate identity. It has its own name. It has its own, not a social security number, but it has its own business identity number. And the decisions that are made as part of the corporation are solely through that corporation. The profits that are made by that corporation go to the corporation and not necessarily even the owners of that corporation, unless they're paid out by dividends or another way. So this is a great legal structure for separating liability, for keeping, for mitigating risk, for keeping the owners safe, right? If you have a sole proprietorship and somebody sues your business, and let's say the legal ownership is sole proprietorship, and you have no insurance covering any type of liability, the people can go after your home, they could go after your wages, they can go after your future wages, even if you close down the company. And so it's a risky ownership type. If you had a corporation, the people can only sue you for the amount that the corporation has and for the life of that corporation. Once it's done, it's done. But not everybody can form a corporation, and they're expensive to form. And so there's a new form of ownership called LLC. It's a limited liability company. And it's like a corporation. There's a lot of the benefits that corporations have, but also a lot of the benefits that sole proprietorships have. So one of the main benefits that a limited liability has is that there's no double taxation. It's a pass-through corporation. And so if you are earning money under a corporation, you're paying money as an individual, and you're also paying money for the corporation. So you're paying money in taxes twice. not in an LLC. In an LLC, it's a pass-through corporation, so you only pay taxes once on the money that comes through. So, like I said, it's the benefits of both corporation and a sole proprietorship, right? So there are many other factors to keep in mind when you are making decisions about what form of ownership you want to choose for your business. One thing I will say, and Roya and I were actually discussing this earlier, you want to make decisions about the business, the type of business ownership. Yes, in the beginning, but it doesn't just have to be in the beginning. It can change. You can start with a sole proprietorship and then change that to a corporation, and then later change that to an LLC structure, and then maybe back to a sole proprietorship. It's okay. You can do that. Sure, there might be some costs associated every time with the filing fees, but just know that you're not stuck in one type of ownership. And so don't try to make decisions like, for example, about maybe getting a corporation if you're not ready to incorporate, right? You have time, you can always do it later. So some of the factors that you need to consider are, yes, the taxes that you'll have to pay, how you'll pay taxes. Will you have double taxation depending on the type of ownership you choose? You have to look at things like liability of the owners, although there are other ways to mitigate risk, including insurance. You have to look at things like the initial costs. There are filing fees every time when you start a new business type. And then certain types of ownership also, there are yearly filing fees, regardless of if you make any money. It's $895 for federally for a corporation, and $800 yearly in the state of California if you have an LLC. Although right now they are waiving that initial filing fee for an LLC in California for the first year. The first year, is that right?
Yeah.
Annual tax. Oh yeah, that's your annual tax. Your annual tax, not your filing fee. Sorry, your annual filing fee. Yeah. You also need to think about things like continuity of the business. By that we mean what happens when you, I hate to say it, but when you die. If you're a sole proprietorship, the business also dies. What happens if you want to give this to some other person? Well, depending on the type of business ownership, it can be tough. It can be tough. So all of these things you need to keep in mind for each of the different options. Now this, just a couple other things about these different types of business ownership. Sole proprietorships, again, remember, it's only one person. If there's more than one person who wants to own the business, you're not going to be operating as a sole proprietorship. There is unlimited liability. The liability is the liability that the business has on the part of the owner extends beyond the owner's investment in the business. So you could potentially lose a lot more money than just the money that you've invested, unlike the other types that we talked about. It is the most basic and it's the most widespread form of ownership. It's the form of ownership that the majority of the companies started in the United States are. And remember, as a sole proprietor, you're typically only taxed once. There are benefits and drawbacks. Don't think that because you have unlimited liability in a sole proprietorship, I'm telling you, never start a sole proprietorship. There are times when it makes sense to start a sole proprietorship. It's easy to start. The costs are virtually nil. There's very few government regulations. You as the owner have all the decision-making abilities. Nobody's going to be able to tell you what to do. And you also earn all of the profits. They go directly to you, to no one else. Now, as a sole proprietorship, you're not going to be able to raise angel funds, for example, or venture capital funds, even more so. It's going to be hard to raise money. It's going to be hard even to get a loan from the bank, even with several years operating as a sole proprietorship. You are working by yourself. It can be stressful. It can be morally taxing. It can be depressing working by yourself. And remember, all of that liability goes to you. The only limit that you can have for liability is if you take out insurance. So that's why people do bring on partners and partnerships. Now, it mitigates against some of the things like being lonely or working alone. You can bring on a friend, but it can have a tremendously detrimental effect on the relationship with that friend if and when things go wrong in a business, and things do. Having those extra people there in the relationship and having their input, their ideas is amazing. It can be extremely helpful, but that form of ownership still probably isn't the best form of ownership to take, even if you are bringing on a partner, because you still have unlimited liability in the lawsuits, but it's not just your own and your business's liability, it's also the other person's potential for liability. And like I said before, partners are fully responsible for all debts and any contracts signed by any of the partners. And so that's why a lot of people choose the protection of corporations. Corporations have their own rights, have their own responsibilities. A corporation can influence politics. They can buy and sell properties. They can be prosecuted. They can enter into a legal agreement. They can enter into a legal real estate contract. They can also issue stocks. And that's how corporations are actually owned. You don't own the corporation, you own the stock in the corporation. That stock is then divided amongst all of the people who own the corporation or have an ownership interest. And that stock or the ownership is proportionate to the amount of stock that you own. And the problem, though, is that you pay tax on that stock. So every single penny that the corporation earns, you pay tax on that money earned. And then again, every single penny that you earn in dividends from the shares that you own, the percentage of the company that you own, you again pay tax on it. And so that's why this is not an ideal structure for a lot of business owners. There are other types of corporations other than the standard C corporation, wherein some of that is mitigated, like an S corporation. An S corporation is also a pass-through corporation where you only pay taxes once, but there are lots of limits on an S corporation. You still need to be a citizen of the United States. You can only have 100 shareholders. All of these things make that not the ideal situation, and that's why a lot of people choose to start their business as an LLC. So some other quick advantages and disadvantages of corporate structures. Corporations are they're the way to go for raising funds. So if you do want to raise funds, especially from angel and venture capitalists, you will likely need to have a corporation and a C corporation. If you want to go public, it has to be a C corporation, right? And by going public, we mean taking that ownership public. You have to be at a certain level in order to do that. And the typical valuation by the time you do an IPO is 500 million. So it's $500 million. So you can see that's when it gets really large. You don't need to right now have your business under the C Corp status just because you're hoping someday to get there. You can always change it later, right? They're expensive to start. They're expensive to maintain. There's a lot of regulations. You have to have a board of directors. You have to have a board of advisors. You have to meet regularly. And so many people choose what's arguably one of the best legal structures, the limited liability company. It is beautiful because people are only taxed once. It's also wonderful because it shields the owner from liability, from potentially being sued and losing their personal assets when they're sued. Because in a LLC, if somebody sues you, all they can sue you for is the amount of money that you have invested in that business. Other than that, it's outside of the business. It's just like a corporation being its own sort of business person. An LLC is very similar in that way. It's its own business person. And the beauty of an LLC is the owners can be foreign born. They can also be other corporations or other trusts where an S Corp owner can't be. It has to be a naturalized person, US citizen, etc. And there's no limit on the amount of members. So this chart just compares each of the forms of business ownership amongst one another. And I showed that very beginning slide, all of the considerations that you have to take into account. This takes into account those considerations like profits, voting, the life of the structure, how you pass it on, how you capitalize or raise money from outsiders. So here are some more resources that you can use to find out more about legal business ownership types. And again, you don't have to make any huge decisions right away. Remember that you can change those decisions. So this is the end of the first section on legal business ownership types. There's even more videos that you can watch. Here's a video, a lecture I gave at SDSU recently on business ownership types. And now I'm going to pass it over to Roya, who's going to be talking to you a little bit more for this first section on the legalities of business. So thank you, and we'll see you again in the next lecture.